there's this concept of a terminal level, right? So it's not only kind of a engineering challenge, but also kind of a marketing challenge or a communication challenge. You're talking about company-wide impact and oftentimes industry-wide impact.
What's up, everybody? How's it going? Today, I'm joined by a very special guest. His name is Rahul. He works at Facebook as a staff software engineer. He's also an adjunct professor at Stanford. I believe that he teaches an Android class there. He also has a YouTube channel where we did a video about coding interviews and he asked me a bunch of questions. I'll put the links to that in the description down below. And today, we're going to talk about what it is that a staff software engineer at a big tech company like Facebook does. So, Rahul, thanks for joining us. If you want to give just a brief background about yourself, and then we can dive into the questions.
Yeah, for sure. So first off, thanks for having me. I'm really excited that we got to make this work. I think, your intro was great. I have been working in Silicon Valley for 7, almost 8 years now. I've been at Pinterest and Facebook, and I went to Stanford for my undergrad and master's degree in computer science.
Cool. And now you're like making the world go round by teaching at Stanford.
Exactly, yeah. So that's a really fun part of just being able to go back and interact with students as a lecturer now, which is super fun.
Cool. And we might touch on that at the end of the video. But first, I want to talk about your job as a staff software engineer. I feel like the term staff software engineer is a pretty kind of a intimidating term sometimes. And a lot of people wonder what it is that a staff software engineer does. So maybe you could tell us what you do on a day-to-day basis, what your daily life is like as a staff software engineer.
Yeah, totally. So let me start by saying that I feel like for staff engineer, and certainly even more senior, like senior staff or principal engineer, there's not really a template of like, here is what a staff engineer should do day to day. It really will depend on what kind of engineer are you and, what are the needs of your team or of your company at that time. So I can talk about my experience. I would say about half of my time goes into actual technical work. And that basically is, reading and writing code, making code changes, putting out a diff. Like a diff is kind of like a GitHub pull request. That's the terminology we use at Facebook. And then the other half of my time is spent in doing architecture review. So, typically as a staff engineer, you're going to be the expert in at least one part of the code base, right? Like you're going to be the person that people come to for questions about that area. And so if they're going to make a change, it's your job essentially to give them guidance, unblock them, and maybe provide an alternate way of thinking about the problem.
I see.
And then I think there's another last component, which is around direction setting. And that basically means, talking to the product manager, the engineering manager, maybe the designer if you have one, and figuring out what is the roadmap for your team for the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, and how can you be the technical voice for that planning. So you can be the person to advocate for a particular solution because of the technical needs, or you can anticipate that, hey, we want to do this thing, but we're not set up for this at all. We need to have this big re-architecture before we can actually make that happen. So we need to start preparing for that now, right? So you have to be kind of the engineering voice, the engineering leader in these meetings, both internally on your team and with other teams to provide that technical direction.
I see. So you definitely need that sort of proactive technical liaison or so with these product managers and other departments and teams. I guess perhaps one question that would be interesting for viewers here, and of course, like you don't have to go into nitty-gritty detail or confidential stuff, but what would you say your domain of expertise is that some people come to you for, architectural guidance?
Yeah, so I would say that where I operate is as a product engineer who sits between the actual feature engineers who are building on top of the product that I own, along with the underlying architecture. So kind of being that glue layer.
Okay.
So I can't talk too much about the specifics of, what the product is that I'm working on or how it works. But, kind of anytime that there is a need from a feature engineer to do something different with the framework, I usually will jump in and say, okay, here's the best practice for how to achieve that. And here's kind of the things you want to watch out for or the questions you want to ask before implementing it. So kind of making sure that people are aware of what might go wrong and how to succeed with what they're trying to do.
I see. And it's very interesting because I feel like at these big tech companies, people don't realize just how big some of these products and code bases are. And so I bet that just as you kind of sit in between, maybe some sort of front end and back end, I'm sure that there are peers of yours who are also staff software engineers, but who might be the points of contact for just the features, or just the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like when you work at one of these large companies, what happens kind of organically is that you have many layers of abstraction built up on top of each other.
Right.
And so you actually need people who are really aware of these abstractions and how to peel back those abstractions to figure out how things really work. And you mentioned earlier about being proactive, right? I feel like a really good way of describing the job of a very senior engineer is shifting from reactive to proactive. So you should be able to understand, okay, here's how the front end roughly works. Here's the area that I'm expert in, that I know like everything about it. And I have a pretty good idea of how the back end works, right? And so where can I anticipate problems? So if there's a change coming up, how can I make sure that that will actually be a seamless change that doesn't cause tech debt, that doesn't cause, issues for users? And how can I make it happen on time with high quality? So a lot of the job is kind of anticipating these abstractions and like what might happen, what might go wrong when you try to integrate different things.
Interesting. Very interesting. And it's a very nuanced type of role. Now, here's a nuanced type of question. What would you say is the difference between a staff software engineer, which you just described, and maybe a senior engineer, so the level right below, or a senior staff, the level right above, and then maybe even, a principal engineer?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally it's about impact. The higher up level you are, the more impact is expected, right? That kind of makes sense. But I think what some people miss in terms of promotion or talking about the different engineering levels is that it's not so much that you get promoted because you do good work and you've finished a feature or you're fixing a bunch of bugs. Promotion happens because of behavior, not because of output. Okay. And that's kind of the key difference in my mind between a senior or staff engineer or senior staff, is that the kinds of problems, the types of problems that you're able to tackle are going to be fundamentally different at each level. Like, let me give you a concrete example. When my first manager kind of gave me this framework, which is that one way to assess how senior you are is think about the question, how far in advance do you know what you're going to work on? So if you're you're a new grad and you just graduated from college, you might be knowing what you work on for the next 3 or 4 days, right? You have a bug to work on and you kind of are going to work on that for a couple of days. If you're a mid-level engineer, you probably know what you're going to work on maybe for a couple of weeks because you're going to be working on this feature. If you're a senior, you probably know for the next maybe 3 months, right? You're kind of owning this whole project and that's going to take up the next 3 months. Once you start getting to staff engineer or senior staff, you have to have the vision in your head about what you're going to work on for the next 6 months or longer. And not only you, but also the people on your team, right? So you want to be able to take a huge problem, decompose it down and say, okay, I'm going to work on this part. And the 3 other people on the team or the 5 other people on the team, here's roughly what they're going to work on as well for the next 6 months. And that's kind of one really concrete litmus test to evaluate, how senior are you in terms of your operational level.
Very interesting. Yeah, I remember when I was still at Facebook, I had read this internal document. Obviously, I won't go into the weeds of it, but it was written by an L9 engineer, I believe, at Facebook, who explained kind of how he had gotten promoted to L9. And it was in L9 being kind of like 2 or 3 levels above staff software engineer. And it was interesting seeing how, yes, he was describing like the projects that he would work on were things that he would kind of anticipate, a year and a half in advance, like, oh, we're going to have to do this entire revamp of like the entire infrastructure layer at Facebook. I'm just giving an arbitrary example, but very interesting. Conversely, and here I might shamelessly plug Algo Expert, Raul, if you're okay with that.
Please do.
But it's interesting because like all these software engineers, even though they have like different seniority levels, they end up still, writing code and still doing like the same fundamental work, and they're interviewed the same way. They have the same coding interviews, although the more senior you get, you have systems design interviews. And for those, you can go to Algo Expert and use the sorry, I messed up. I just messed up my promotion of Algo Expert. Raul is probably like completely face palming. I've done this so many times. How could I mess up? But no, for those, if you're preparing for your coding interviews or systems design interviews for any level, then you can go check out Algo Expert. You can go to algoexpert.io and use the promo code CLEM, CLEM, for a discount on the platform. Raul, thank you for allowing me to do this shameless promotion. But let's move on to the next question that I think might be really interesting, which is, can everyone become a staff software engineer? I know that it's difficult to become a software engineer or a staff software engineer. Do you think that everyone has what it takes? Should everyone become a staff software engineer? And here the reason I ask that is because like it probably comes with a lot of stress, probably comes with a lot of responsibilities. Do you think that for some people it's just better to stop at, like let's say senior software engineer?
Right. I think it's a very interesting question. For the can everyone become a staff engineer? I think the answer is yes. It takes time and effort though, right? It's not something that you just get on a team and you become staff, even if you're a phenomenal engineer. And the reason is because I feel like once you get to that level, there's a big expectation about you setting the direction and vision technically for your team.
Right.
And the way you do that is by building trust with your product manager, your engineering manager, the other folks, the other engineers on the team, right? And you don't build trust overnight. So even if you're a great engineer, you have to prove to them that, okay, you can deliver projects on time, high quality, you can help unblock other people. And that's how you're able to build that trust, build those relationships, and then advance to staff engineer. So I think kind of the ingredients to actually get there, and I think everyone could find it, is you have to be on a team which actually has a lot of scope and is expanding that scope so you can kind of grow with that, right?
Yeah.
Second, you have to obviously have the technical underpinnings, right? So you have to be able to deliver projects that are high quality, on time. And the third component is you need to be able to start having an opinion about where the team should go, right? So it's not enough just to be kind of reactive and like doing the projects that you're told. You need to start advocating for, here is what I think we should do. Here's what I think the good and bad parts about our current architecture, and here's how we need to adapt, right? And so I think if you find a team where you have that opportunity, everyone could become a staff software engineer. Now the question is, you asked, should everyone become a staff software engineer? I think that one's a little trickier because I think, like you mentioned, the higher up you go on the ladder, the more expectation there is to land impact. And that can become actually quite stressful. So for example, if you are very content just putting your head down, doing your work, not having to think about, getting buy-in or like setting the vision for the team, then maybe you don't want to be a staff engineer, right? Because there's going to be some expectation on your time to actually do that and convince people and be in these meetings where you have to advocate for a certain technical direction, right?
Right.
And so if you don't want to spend your days doing that kind of thing, then maybe you're actually going to be happier and actually more successful as a senior engineer. And maybe there's also other paths you could explore, right? I think we might talk later about engineering management, or some companies have this role called a TLM, tech lead manager, right? There's other paths available to you that are not simply climbing up the engineering ladder.
Right, and I think that's a really, important point that some people really need to hear, because I think some people kind of blindly, through no fault of their own, think that they just have to go up the ladder. You become a software engineer and you just gotta go up the ladder. But like you said, ultimately you might actually end up being not only happier, but even better performing as a senior software engineer. And depending on, your motivations, you might also be perfectly content with, let's say, the compensation that you're getting, because, you're getting great compensation at these types of companies if you're a senior software engineer. And so that's a really good point. I guess now we could dive into engineering management, since you mentioned it. What is the difference between an engineering manager and a staff software engineer, for example? Because as far as I know, if you're a senior engineer, maybe you would want to, instead of staff software engineer, go into engineering management. But how would you say those two roles are different?
Totally, yeah. So I think, again, let me caveat this by saying again that the definition of what is an engine manager, TLM versus TL is going to vary a little bit company to company. But I think broadly speaking at FAANG, right, at these big tech companies in Silicon Valley, or these big companies that are primarily US based, I would say that the job of an engineering manager is very people focused.
Yeah.
So their job is actually, at least at Facebook, their job is they have no responsibility to set architecture or technical vision. It's much more about, are the people on your team, are they happy? Are they being challenged enough? And are you minimizing the amount of work that they need to do that is not actually having any real impact, right? Basically, can you unlock as much productivity as possible for your engineers? And there's some overlap there with staff engineer, where, one way to think about staff engineers are that they're a multiplying force for the engineering team. So they're the ones who are setting the architecture, which will allow everyone to move faster, or they're kind of solving a whole class of bugs, right? So that's kind of overlapping in that dimension. But the big difference is that there's no responsibility to kind of grow the people around you on in their career, right? There's no kind of mentorship requirement as such, even though that does happen organically sometimes. It's much more focused on technical vision and technical architecture, whereas the eng manager is going to be much more people focused.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to kind of summarize it, that last sentence. And I think that to anyone who's wondering like which path they should go down, that's really the main question you have to ask yourself. Are you the kind of person who wants to not only work with other people, because you're obviously going to work with other people as a staff software engineer, but who wants to have other people truly depend on them, like their happiness almost depend on you? That's eng manager. Whereas staff software engineer is like, if you want to keep doing a lot of technical work, that's probably the path you want to go.
One thing I just want to add on there is I think I 100% agree with kind of the way you described it. The one thing that I think people might forget is that if you're an eng manager, it's actually quite valuable to have the technical background though. Because I think when someone comes to you for a problem or they want to advance their career in a certain way, being able to speak the language of an engineer and actually having been an engineer is invaluable in order to gain respect as a manager. So even if you already decided right now in your career that, okay, I want to be a manager for sure when I advance my career, I think it's going to pay dividends if you really focus on the technical side right now, because that's going to basically give you a lot of respect and it'll help you in your eng manager career as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that at a lot of these big tech companies, it's almost a requirement, if not certainly a requirement, to have been an engineer in order to become an engineering manager. Now, if you want, here's one fun question that I just thought of, kind of a controversial question, so feel free to answer however you wish, but do you think that it's harder to become a staff software engineer than an engineering manager?
Yeah, okay, this is a very interesting question. I feel like, one way to look at the question is through data, right? And if you look at the median manager level, you'll actually find that the median manager is at a higher level compared to the median engineer, in the sense that, there's this concept of a terminal level, right? Terminal level basically means that you can get to the point in your career and stay at that level for the rest of your career, and no one's gonna force you to change, right? You're productive, you're doing good work. And that level is actually one level lower than the terminal level for management.
Right.
And so from that perspective, you could argue that, hey, if I wanted to just simply optimize my place on the ladder, you could argue that, it's better to go on the management track. And I think that's, for some people, that might be a motivation to go into management, even though that's not kind of the best reason to do management. Ideally, you want to go into management to help people.
Right.
But I think, from that perspective, it is kind of easier to kind of hit that terminal level at a higher level on the manager track compared to the IC track.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think that here is just relying on data, but then also relying on kind of intuition. Obviously, this can be debated, but I think that the higher up you go in the software engineering track, not eng manager track, the more you really need to have technical brilliance, right, and true technical prowess, and that is, again, very debatable, but it's arguably harder than influence or impact on people. I mean, it's a tough question. There's no clear answer, but it seems like the data indicates and intuition kind of pushes you in the direction of believing that engineering is a little bit more difficult than management.
And that's a really good point that you brought up. You talked about how you read this profile of this level 9, super, super senior engineer. And when you get to that level of an individual contributor, then you have to really be operating on the scale of the work that I'm doing has not just team impact or organizational impact. You're talking about company-wide impact and oftentimes industry-wide impact. You have to be inventing frameworks or inventing libraries that are now going to become the standard across the whole industry. That's the level that you have to operate at. So I think that's a really good point. You could argue that that's actually very, very hard to do consistently over the course of your career. Whereas if you're a manager, you can climb up the ranks simply by trusting, building relationships with the right people and gaining that context and being able to put people in the right positions, right? So there is an argument to be made that, managers, you don't need as much technical brilliance to advance up that ladder.
Right, which is debatably makes it a little bit easier. But
Yeah.
awesome. Listen, Raul, maybe we can talk about one last thing here, which would be what would you say the toughest thing you've had to do as a staff software engineer is at Facebook?
So I can't talk about the specifics of the project, but I can talk about it kind of at a higher level, which is this is like a year-long project that I took on. And basically, I was integrating this architecture into our product. And the interesting thing here was that the architecture was already developed by another partner team in the company. And so my job was basically evaluating this architecture and trying to understand where would be the difficulties with integrating that into our product, because our product actually had certain assumptions about it that made it not just a vanilla integration.
Okay.
There were certain things that we had to tweak or modify. So that was like one part of it that was actually quite interesting. And the other part is I mentioned how I kind of sit between the front end and back end a little bit. And so the other part of it was convincing all the people who were going to be building new features on this architecture that I was migrating to, and basically convincing them about the value of the new architecture and helping them in the migration. So it's not only kind of an engineering challenge of gluing these pieces together, but also kind of a marketing challenge or a communication challenge of making sure that people were aware of this migration and how can I make it as painless as possible for everyone on my team to be able to adopt this new architecture. And in some cases that required actually doing the work for them, or in other cases it meant being able to like consult and like give them technical guidance as they did the work. But it really was kind of a wide-ranging project that touched almost every part of the stack.
It's very interesting how you put it, like marketing. I think that's actually a brilliant way to put it. It's almost like technical marketing, right? You effectively have to market to internal engineers, your peers, why this technical project is technically sound. And this is like surprisingly hard when you are touching so many different teams and products and people and all that. I remember like at Google, I was on Google Cloud and we had this big like Google Cloud-wide framework migration, and it was just a huge like marketing effort to convince people, engineers, like TLs, staff software engineers that it was a worthy migration to do. So very interesting. Listen, Raul, thank you so much for sharing all this. I think that this was super insightful, super valuable. I really hope that all of you watching were able to get a clearer picture of what a staff software engineer does, how to become one, what's difficult about it. I certainly learned a lot from this conversation. We did another video on Raul's channel where we talked about coding interviews, and he asked me like what I thought about them. We kind of dug deep into why companies assess candidates with that. So definitely go check it out if you're interested. I'll put the links in the description below. And Raul, any last words?
No, I think this is great. I'm really glad we were finally able to find time to put this together. I love teaching. We talked about the Stanford part, and most of my YouTube channel is actually focused on teaching, primarily about Android, but also a couple other topics. So I'd love to connect with people if they're interested. I can leave a comment on the video to just point people toward my YouTube or Twitter. I'd love to connect if anyone has any questions.
Definitely. And I know that like Android is a pretty mobile development in general, but Android is a pretty hot or highly sought out skill these days. So definitely go check it out if you're interested. Thanks again. And if you enjoy the video, please smash the like button. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter if you enjoy short form written content. Instagram if you like pictures. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video.
Bye. See you all.